push the information in the right way to the listener and the viewer. And it was essentially the Ukraine war 1 year later. So I guess could you recap that and maybe give us a little bit of the playbook of how we've gotten to where we are today?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you on this podcast and great to have the chance to talk about these complicated subjects as clearly as we can, but great to have the chance to talk about all of this with you. So to jump in terms of where we are, there are a lot of stories to be told about this war. I think you do want to put Ukraine and Russia front and center. So let's start with Russia. Russia began the war obviously on the expectation that things would go its way, which hasn't happened. So quite quickly, Russia found itself fighting a war that it would not have chosen to fight. And the results have been, the best word I could use on the Russian side, the results have been paradoxical. That on the one hand, Russia occupies and controls about 17% of Ukrainian territory, has wreaked absolute havoc across the country, whether it comes to internally displaced people or to the Ukrainian economy. Really sort of unspeakable civilian suffering, which we've very much seen on display in the last couple of days because of the flooding and the destroyed dam. Russia has sort of kept itself afloat militarily and economically, and has a partner of sorts in China, and has a degree of international support for this war that I wouldn't have predicted beforehand, but that ranges from countries like India to countries like Brazil and South Africa. So on that side of the ledger, you could say Russia has not fought the war that it's wanted to fight, but not everything has gone against it. On the other hand, sort of for Russia, the expenditure of material and manpower has been absolutely extraordinary. Its isolation from Europe and the United States is also pretty remarkable. And it's very, very hard to say what Russia has really won in return, even looking at the world from Putin's point of view. So it's in the middle of this war. It's wreaking a lot of destruction. It's not without partners, but it's very much at sea. It's sort of adrift in terms of what it's aiming to accomplish. That's I think, probably the crux of the Russian story. It's doing something it doesn't understand. It doesn't have clear, achievable goals for its war, to put it mildly. On the Ukrainian side, you can tell a story that's also somewhat paradoxical, that the war has been, as I've mentioned, totally devastating. It's a major war. It touches on every aspect of Ukrainian life and does all of the things that wars do in terms of bloodshed and loss of security and trauma and all of that. It's still not the case that Ukraine is completely embedded in something like the NATO alliance or in Western security structures, and Ukraine is trying to find its way in that respect while dealing with a very powerful adversary in the form of Russia. On the other hand, I think if you would look at where things were in the first week of the war, Ukraine's performance has been extraordinary militarily. It's held its own in terms of keeping together politically. There's not a question about that. President Zelensky is clearly a good communicator. Level of morale is high. And even though Ukraine is not a part of the NATO alliance, it's gotten huge amounts of support from the United States and other outside powers that are building Ukraine into one of Europe's major militaries. And so in that sense, not only is Russia adrift and at sea, but it's facing an adversary in Ukraine that's getting stronger by the week and stronger by the month. So, these sort of paradoxes on both sides are the story of the war so far. And of course, we can bring a lot of other factors into the mix if you're interested: China, Europe, the United States, etc. But let me leave it at that for the time being. A paradoxical war in which neither side is completely winning and neither side is completely losing.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think we're definitely going to get into some of the other entities because there are a lot. And I'd be interested in talking about some of those countries that have come out and support Russia, surprisingly. But I guess staying in Russia and Ukraine to begin with, who does this paradoxical war favor? Because we see a country like Ukraine, in many ways, people might initially say this is obviously in their favor, but the war is on their home territory. It's a very grinding war. Situations like Bakhmut are happening where very bloody. It's a terrible kind of meat grinder type of war. So it's hard to keep up morale for who knows how long this war can go for. But then on the other end, you have Russia, who at home is seeing a lot of murmurs of kind of negative views of the war and, you know, its own internal struggle. So who does this favor? And I guess on the flip end, who does this hurt more?
Right. I mean, I think it's very, very hard to say in terms of ultimate outcomes who at the moment is in the stronger position. You could almost make the argument that both countries have been and sort of will remain by far the worst for the sake of this war, that in a way it's a kind of zero-sum. That there's a zero-sum element to the war. It's true for a lot of wars, and maybe especially true of this one, because victory is a little bit hard to define on both sides of the equation. Not that Ukrainians have a hard time defining it. They want their territory, their sovereignty, their independence back. They want to be peaceful, safe, and secure. But how to get there is a pretty difficult problem. You can make a case for time being on the side of each country. Obviously, it's a different case. That in the case of Russia, it's a big economy, it's a big population, it's a big military that they have what experts would describe as strategic depth. That means that they can sort of fall back on these resources. The war is not, for the most part, being fought on Russian territory, and in many ways, Russia has sort of muddled through. And when you have a dictator who is ruthlessly pursuing a single aim, which is what Putin is doing in Ukraine, it's just a different dynamic from a democracy where, you know, public opinion plays a role and you have differences of view, you have different political parties. And it's not to say that dictatorships are better at fighting wars. I think Putin has shown that dictatorships of the kind that he rules over are quite problematic when it comes to waging war. But still, in terms of sticking to the course, it may be the case that Putin has the ingredients that he needs to keep the war going for a long time. And it's easy to make that case on the side of Ukraine. They're not going to surrender because that would mean the death of their country. So that's, you know, crystal clear, I think, in the minds and in the spirit of Ukrainians. And I don't think that the United States or Europe is going to turn away from supporting Ukraine anytime soon. And that's in part out of humanitarian commitment to the people of Ukraine, commitment to Ukraine as a democratic project, but it's also a very strong interest of the U.S. not to have Europe descend into chaos and military tension and you know, sort of an even wider war than the one that we see, which is possible if Russia would succeed and be able to claim victory in Ukraine. So the U.S. and Europe has a vested interest in blocking Russia in Ukraine. Is going to stick with this war for a very long time to come for that reason. So, you know, if it's a war of attrition, you can kind of play it both ways. You know, Russia could stay the course. It's got certain advantages structurally over Ukraine, but if you look at Ukraine and its ally structure, you know, all of the partners that are supporting it, it's some of the richest countries, best economies, biggest economies in the world. So it's not as if Ukraine's prospects in a war of attrition are bleak at all. The question is, and it's really too soon to answer, of course, is which of the assets on either side cancel out the assets of the other one? Is it Putin's sort of dictatorial will? Does that cancel out the consensus that democracies need to keep on going with a war? Or does the high level of morale and the technological sophistication that the West is going to give Ukraine militarily, does that cancel out whatever advantages may be there on the Russian side? It's those things that we have to try to balance against each other. And of course, it's really hard to say how exactly all of this is how it's going to play out over the next couple of months and years.